The winter of 1871 came early to the settlement of Dry Creek, a lonely outpost of 100 souls clinging to the edge of the Texas plains, where the wind never stopped and the horizon felt like the edge of the world. Sarah Whitlock had lived there for 3 years, her hands calloused from baking bread in the heat of her clay oven, her heart made tender by the memory of a husband buried on the trail west. And when the Comanche began appearing on the ridge, not with war paint but with hunger in their eyes, she did what few dared, she fed them. It began with a single boy, maybe 10 years old, standing at the edge of her fence with a hand pressed to his belly, too weak to beg. She gave him cornbread and smoked meat, and when he vanished into the sagebrush without a word, she thought that was the end of it. But the next night there were 3 children, and by the end of the week, she was carrying baskets beyond the ridge under moonlight, leaving them for whoever found them. In a place where fear of the savages was more common than a kind word, her actions spread like wildfire through whispers, and whispers turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to rage. The sheriff, a man who measured justice by the weight of gold in his pocket, saw a chance to make an example. He called a meeting, claimed she was supplying the enemy, and that if the Comanche grew bold enough to attack, it would be her fault. On a morning so cold the frost clung to every window pane, they came for her, 4 men in long coats, knocking the door clean off its hinges, dragging her barefoot into the snow while she struggled to keep the shawl around her shoulders. "Sarah Whitlock, you are charged with treason against this settlement," the mayor's voice rang out from the gallows already built in the square, as if they'd decided her fate days ago. She looked out at the crowd. Some couldn't meet her eyes, some spat at her feet, a few mouthed silent apologies, and said only, "I fed the hungry." The rope was rough against her neck, the preacher's words drowned out by the howl of the wind, and when the trapdoor fell away beneath her, the sound of her body swinging in the bitter air was the only thing anyone remembered clearly. They buried her outside town, no marker, no prayer. To the townsfolk, it was over. But out beyond the plains, in the winter camps of the Comanche, the story had just begun. The wind carried the news before any white man could, drifting like smoke through the Comanche winter camp along the Pecos River, where 300 riders sharpened arrowheads beneath the skeletal arms of cottonwood trees. They heard it from a boy, the same boy Sarah had fed first, who rode into camp half frozen, clutching a bundle of cornbread in his coat, his voice breaking as he told the elders what the settlers had done. In the council lodge, the chiefs sat in a circle, the fire snapping between them, its light dancing over the paint on their faces. The oldest, Iron Hawk, listened without speaking, his eyes deep as canyon shadows. He had known hunger like this boy's, and he had known the rare kind of white heart that would give without asking. Sarah Whitlock, they decided, had not been enemy, she had been kin of the spirit, and to kill such a one was not just cruelty, it was an insult to the honor of the people. Vengeance, then, would not be a raid for cattle or grain, it would be a reckoning so sharp the name Dry Creek would vanish like smoke. Through the night, the warriors readied themselves, painting their faces in black and red, braiding their hair tight for war, whispering to their ponies in the dark. Women stitched fresh quivers, and young boys carried arrows to the men like an offering. At dawn, 300 riders stood at the edge of camp, the frost in. Their hair and breath curling from their mouths, the sound of hooves muffled on frozen earth. Iron Hawk raised his lance, decorated with the feathers of a golden eagle, and the line moved as one, a silent tide rolling east toward Dry Creek. They rode without song, without war cries, the only sound the creak of leather and the hiss of the wind, for this was not a celebration, it was justice. By noon they reached the ridge above the settlement, the same ridge where Sarah had once left her baskets of food. From there they could see the gallows still standing, its shadow long in the winter sun. Iron Hawk's jaw tightened. The younger warriors shifted in their saddles, eager to rush, but he held up his hand. They would not come like raiders in the night. They would come in full daylight, so the guilty would see the justice riding toward them. And so, 300 ponies began their descent, a wall of hooves and muscle and painted faces, and the first man in Dry Creek to notice them was the sheriff, who dropped his coffee mug in the snow when he realized the horizon itself was moving toward him. The riders poured into Dry Creek like a storm breaking over the prairie, sunlight flashing off polished rifle barrels, war paint streaked across faces like lightning marks, and the low thunder of hooves shaking the frozen ground beneath the wooden sidewalks. Doors slammed, shutters banged shut, and townsfolk scattered like startled quail, but there was no mistaking it, the Comanche were not here for cattle or loot. They came for the gallows, and for the men who had stood beneath it on the day Sarah Whitlock's feet kicked in the wind. Sheriff Calvin Boone staggered backward, his hand fumbling for the pistol at his hip, but before he could draw it, a rider swept past and knocked him flat with the butt of a rifle, the sheriff's hat spinning into the snow. At the center of the tide rode Iron Hawk, feathers snapping in the wind, eyes locked on the gallows. He dismounted without a word, walking toward the weathered beams like a man stepping up to a grave, his hand brushing the rope still hanging there, the rope that had touched Sarah's neck. He turned to face the cowering townsfolk, who were now pressed against storefronts and behind barrels, and spoke in a voice deep enough to still the wind. His words, in Comanche, were translated by a younger warrior: "She fed us when you would have let us starve. She gave without fear. You killed her for kindness. Now you will learn what justice feels like." 3 men were dragged forward, the same ranchers who had voted for Sarah's hanging, the same ones who had spat at her boots as the trapdoor fell. The townsfolk looked away, but Iron Hawk made them watch as the warriors tied the men's hands, looped the rope over the same beam, and waited for his signal. There was no cheer, no wild whoop, just the sound of the wind and the creak of rope as justice swung. Then Iron Hawk raised his lance, and the riders turned their ponies, moving through the streets in grim silence, knocking the gallows flat as they left. When the last hoofprint faded into the snow, Dry Creek was not the same. The townsfolk would whisper Sarah Whitlock's name for generations, not in pity, but in the hushed awe reserved for those who crossed every line for what was right. And somewhere out on the open plains, where the wind runs free, 300 Comanche riders carried her memory with them, not as a victim, but as a sister of the spirit. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the price of doing what's right, then make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next ride into the untamed heart of the Old West.